Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire, and it is an honor to be here on the Simon Says Stamp YouTube channel. I am here today to celebrate the newest STAMPtember collab, and it is with MemoryBox. MemoryBox is one of my favorite companies. I love their designs, and today's stamp set does not disappoint. In this video, I will show you how easy it is to do mirror stamping so you can get a reverse image. And this allows you to get so much more out of your stamp sets. And believe it or not, it's not hard to do. So let's look at that MemoryBox STAMPtember collab. It is this adorable 4x6 stamp set, and there are coordinating dies available together and separately. I love having that option. I'll just be using this stamp set today. I thought these images were fantastic. Look how cute that Santa is in the corner. Today I'm focusing on the penguin and the snowman, but I do need to try this technique with that Santa sometime. I do feel like it's important to remind you that STAMPtember collabs will sell out and not be restocked, but there are a lot of great images like this from MemoryBox that you can use for this technique, or you may have something in your stash. Now I will be showing you a couple different ways to do mirror stamping today. The first one gives the best results. I am using the Simon Says Stamp Tacky mat. That is this mat that you see here. It is clear and it is made of stamp material. On the back side, there are like lines engraved in it. And then the front side, or the side facing up towards the camera, is super smooth and flat. Now that acetate piece with the black grid, you can either have on it or just take it off. I like to have mine on the back so I can see the grid lines better, and I'm able to move this around on my desk. Without that acetate piece on the back, it will stick there, which is great if that's how you want to use it, but I like to be able to move it around. And as you can see, this fits nicely in the MISTI stamping tool and replaces any of the pads that the MISTI comes with. Now let me show you what this is like without that acetate on the back, without the black grid. You can see that fine grid line that's kind of engraved in the back, along with marks for an A2 card, 5x7 card, and more. I find that really helpful. But keep in mind, there are many different kinds of mats like this on the market that are made of stamp material and have a little bit of grip to them. So any of them will work for this technique. So I'm taking my tacky mat and I'm putting it inside my MISTI stamping tool, and you'll see it sticks in there. So I have the smooth side facing up towards the camera. Now for this technique, you want to make sure that your tacky mat is as clean as possible. I like to use a stamp cleaner such as Ultra Clean. I spray a couple sprays of it on, and then I use a wet cloth to wipe that away. And then I come in with a dry cloth to dry it. Now this will stain. By nature, it is really a giant stamp, right? And stamps do stain, but you can remove the ink with that stamp cleaner and it won't transfer to your next project. So now our MISTI stamping tool with that tacky mat is ready to go. For my first way of doing mirror stamping, we'll use that tacky mat. But I'll show you another way if you don't have a mat like this, another way to do mirror stamping later in this video. All right, now let's create our card base. I have a piece of heavyweight white cardstock that is 8.5 by 11, and I'm using my Simon Says Stamp scoreboard to score right down the center at 5.5 inches. I really like this scoreboard because it's hard to see, but there's a groove at the top, like little notches where you can place the tip of your bone folder into it and then drag it down the groove. And this helps to keep your scoring tool in the groove so it doesn't jump out of the groove. It just makes it much easier. So once I have scored this very well at 5.5 inches, I'm flipping it over and scoring it again at 5.5 inches. I am using a very heavy weight cardstock for this. This is actually Neenah Classic Crest Solar White and 110 pound. And sometimes scoring from both sides helps to get a better score line. For this technique, I actually do recommend 130 pound cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. I ran out of it, so I didn't have that to use today, but I do like that because I will be coloring directly on the front of this card, and I don't want the color showing through to the inside. You'll see my color does show through a little bit, but if I had used a heavier 130 pound cardstock, I wouldn't have had that problem. I'm putting a little bit of adhesive on the inside of the card just to hold it closed as we do stamping. And I'm putting a pencil mark at the top right corner. So I know that's the side where the card opens. The crease is on the other side. I just don't want to accidentally make my card upside down. Before we start stamping, I wanted to share a trick with you. I was creating this morning and I was making a mess with ink. Have you ever had a time where you're creating and you just seem to get ink prints everywhere and just make a mess? Like you're just particularly messy? That was my morning. So I decided to make sure this card worked out without any fingerprints. So I cut a piece of Gina K Masking Magic to be 4¼ by 5½ inches. And I'm putting it on the back of my note card. That way I won't accidentally get ink on the back when I'm creating. I like to do this whenever I'm inking directly onto a note card or stamping on the note card. That way I can be sure that the back is protected and we don't get any fingerprints or extra ink there. I find it very handy. When I'm done, I can remove that Masking Magic piece. I stick it onto the inside of my cabinet door and I'll reuse it several times. So that's on the back side of our white note card. All right, so I'm putting my note card into my stamping tool, and the nice thing is that Tacky mat will hold it there and I don't need a magnet. I'm using another helpful tool in today's video. This is the Simon Says Stamp Perfect Placement Guide. It actually comes with a white piece also, and this is helpful for many things, which I'll demonstrate today. There is a bigger size available too. I'm taking this clear one with the grid, which is nice and thick, and placing it over my card. Onto that, I'm lining up my penguin where I want him to be stamped. The reason I put that clear guide behind it is you can see my stamp is dirty and I don't want to accidentally get any ink where I don't want it. I want to make sure I have it positioned right before I put it to my paper. So I had that grid there just while I was placing it. Then I closed the door on my MISTI stamping tool, grabbed the stamp, and now I'm stamping it with Altenew Obsidian Black Pigment ink. You could use any pigment ink for this, but I really like this particular ink and I'll talk about that more in a moment. So I've stamped my penguin, just did regular stamping for that. I do want to heat set this because this is a pigment ink. I want to make sure I don't smear it because I told you today I'm being extra messy for some reason. Now I wanted to have the snowman next to him, but notice that the penguin and the snowman are both looking off to the left. I wanted them to look at each other. So I want my snowman to be flipped. I want it to be a mirror or reverse image so he's looking at the penguin when they hold hands. This is a great way to get more out of your stamps, and it's called mirror stamping. So I need it to be flipped, but that's not how the stamp works, right? So I'm going to show you a trick. So earlier, I stamped the snowman onto a piece of thin paper. This is actually junk mail that I got. I saved it because it's super thin and works great for this technique. Any kind of printer paper would work also. I stamped the snowman on it just like I normally would stamp, and I just cut him out roughly. You could use the die to cut it out if you want, but it really doesn't matter. I'm flipping that over and placing it next to the penguin where I want that reverse or mirror image to be stamped. I'm making sure their hands overlap so it looks like they're holding hands. And I'm taping that in place. I hope you can see through that and see the outline of the image and where it will be stamped. So again, I just stamped it normal, flipped that piece over and taped it down. Now I'll take the stamp and put it upside down on top of that white piece that we have taped there. So what you're looking at is the part of the stamp that stamps. The flat back of the stamp is actually touching my card. So I have the stamp upside down. Don't worry, it'll work out great. Now I'll take my MISTI stamping tool. Remember, it's got the tacky mat in it. I'll hold the stamp against the card so it doesn't shift. And then I will flip it over and take the card and put it into the corner of my stamping tool. I'll press that down so that the tacky mat grabs that stamp. So right now you're looking at the back of the stamp. I'll close the door of my stamping tool to grab the stamp, and now we just have the snowman mounted exactly where we want him. It's just like a regular stamp. So you could ink this up and stamp it on paper and it'd be normal. But what we're going to do is ink it up and stamp it onto that tacky mat. Now let's take a moment to talk more about the ink that I'm using. I'm using Altenew Obsidian Pigment ink. VersaFine Pigment ink would work well here also. You could do this with a different black dye ink, but I do find Pigment ink works particularly well for this. So I would try either this Altenew Obsidian Black Pigment ink or VersaFine Black Pigment ink. You could also use VersaMark, which would be clear, and then do the same process and heat emboss it. Now, if you don't have a pigment ink, you can definitely do this with a dye ink, but you'll have to repeat the process a couple times. But I will say, if you don't have a fine pigment ink like this one or the VersaFine, I recommend getting one. All right, now I'll ink up my snowman stamp. It's a regular stamp. And instead of stamping it on paper, I'm stamping it directly onto that tacky mat. And this will give a nice transfer of ink because remember that tacky mat is made of stamp material, so it will take that ink beautifully. I repeated that a couple times, and now I'll take my note card, flip it over, and put it directly into the corner of my stamping tool, and I'll press around with my fingers. I'll peel that off and check this out. The ink transferred, and now we have a reverse image. The stamp, remember, had the snowman facing to the left. This gives you the snowman facing to the right. So now they look like they're friends holding hands. Now you'll see that I got a nice transfer of ink. It looks like I stamped that snowman directly. But if yours didn't transfer the ink completely, you could repeat the process. Ink up the stamp again, stamp it onto the tacky mat, and press your cardstock back into the corner of the MISTI and put more ink down. So sometimes you have to repeat the process, but I was able to do it on the first pass. And think about all the different images you can get mirror images of. So you could have stamped the penguin and then done the reverse technique to get another penguin, and they'd be holding hands looking at each other. All right, now this was pigment ink again. I'm going to heat set that. You may have noticed I did get a fingerprint on this because it's just one of those days, but that's okay. I use either a paper sander, which I'm using here, or a mono sand eraser to erase those little fingerprints, and no one will ever know. But to avoid that from happening again, I'm taking another piece of Masking Magic and putting it on the left-hand side here because I'm not going to do anything on that part of the card. So I might as well protect it as I do some more stamping. I'm telling you, it's just one of those messy days. All right, now I can open up my card, and remember I put a little bit of tape runner in there. I'll erase that adhesive using an adhesive eraser. It just rubs away nicely, and you don't have to worry about your paper tearing or having any of that adhesive in there. The next step on this card is to cut that front edge. Notice that I have cut right up against the penguin, so the penguin's kind of hanging off the edge. So I want to cut right along the penguin, but not through the penguin. So you could do partial die cutting for this. You could do partial die cutting if you had the coordinating die, but I'm not using the coordinating die today. I am using the Tim Holtz Precision Trimmer. This is a great trimmer because, as you can watch me do here, you can drop the blade wherever you want and lift it wherever you want. So you can partially cut and not cut the entire piece. Now, if you don't have this, you could use a straight edge and a craft knife to do the same thing. So I've opened up my card and I'm placing the front into my trimmer. And I want to cut all the way down to the top, or to like part of the penguin's hat. So I can drop this blade down and drag it down and then lift it when I reach the top of his hat. Again, if you don't have a trimmer like this, you could definitely use a craft knife and straight edge. So I'll just drag it down to the top of the hat and then lift the blade up. And you can see that I have cut all the way to the top of his hat. Now I'll move to the bottom. I'll start at the bottom of the penguin and drag the blade down to the bottom of the card. So now I have cut lines above and below our penguin. Next, I'll use my scissors to fussy cut half of that penguin. Now, I know not everyone likes to fussy cut, but this is only half of an image, and I'm cutting the little pom-pom off the top of his hat, which saves me a lot of time. If you didn't want to do fussy cutting here, you could have done a partial die cutting technique, but I thought this was easy and it didn't require me getting the dies out. So when I fussy cut, I just kind of cut in the tight places like you see me doing here, and then I cut around it. It really makes it pretty simple. You can see it didn't take me very long to do this. And I know not many people like fussy cutting, but sometimes it's worth it, and I think this is one of those times. Whenever I do fussy cutting, I like to take a black marker and just trace around the outside edge. So I'm not coloring on our cut edge here on our penguin. I'm coloring next to it. I'm just tracing it. And this puts black ink along the outside edge of where we cut, and it just makes it look cleaner. Now we can color in our images. You could color these in however you want. I'm choosing to use my Caron markers because I haven't used them in a while and I forgot how much I love them. These brush markers can be used in many, many ways with water and so on. I'm just doing basic coloring. Now, because I used a heavyweight white cardstock, I don't have to worry about much of this color leaking through to the inside and showing on the back. But if you used a lighter weight cardstock, you might want to include an extra piece of cardstock on the inside to hide this coloring that we're doing if it kind of bleeds through. So I continue to add coloring to this, and I thought I'd share with you the colors I use in case you were interested. For all the greens, I used grass, lush green, and apple. Then for the pool colors, I used turquoise and cool aqua. And for orange, I used amber and pale orange. Now for the snowman, I wanted a little bit of shading, just a little bit, so I used my Copic marker C0. Don't be afraid to mix your different markers together. So I used Cairn markers for the clothing, and then just for the shading on the snowman, I used a light Copic marker. This didn't add a whole lot, but in real life you can see a bit of shading. Next, I have a black Sharpie. This is just a fine tip Sharpie, and I thought I'd make the snowman's eyes solid and also give him a tiny little smile. And I'm using this pen to fill in the bottom of the snowman where the lines weren't completely solid when I did my mirror stamping technique. Next, I will use a B000 Copic marker, which is a really light blue, just to scribble a little ground beneath them, just something subtle. I'm not the best at coloring, but I got the job done. All right, now I want to have a stamped border that will be on the inside of the card and will show when the card is closed. So I have a piece of Concord & Ninth Aqua Sky cardstock, and I have the border stamp that's included in the Memory Box So Very Merry stamp set. After I stamped it once, I'll shift it in my MISTI stamping tool, use that perfect placement guide on top of my cardstock just so I don't get any ink on it, and I'll move my stamp and I'll make sure it lines up with what we already have. Before I stamp this on my cardstock, I'll stamp onto that clear placement guide to make sure I like the results. It's hard for you to see, but I could see it there and I could see that it lined up. So now I can remove the placement guide, wipe it clean, and stamp onto my cardstock. By the way, I'm using Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated ink in the Surf color. It needs a little re-inking, so I had to stamp it a few times. All right, now we have a longer border that we created with the smaller border image. And that is yet another use of the perfect placement guide. You can do practice stamping on it. Now I'll trim this border down and I'll glue it to the inside edge of our note card. That way you'll see it when the card is open and closed. I will also place a thin strip of silver cardstock right next to it, and that will also show when the card is opened or closed. I love doing this kind of short edge on the front of the card. It's just something fun and different and not something you could buy at the store. All right, now let's stamp our sentiment. I'm using the So Very Merry, which is included in the stamp set. Now I'm putting my card into my MISTI stamping tool. It's held there by that tacky mat. On top of it, I'm placing the placement guide, so I can play around with different places to stamp my sentiment. I wasn't sure where I wanted it. At first, I thought I wanted it down onto the left, but I moved it around with the placement guide, and I decided I liked it better right up between our little friends here. I use my placement guide a lot to do this, but you could also use clear packaging for this step. All you have to do is wipe the ink off when you're done. I usually just use a baby wipe and it comes right off. Okay, now I can move my stamp to where I want it. And before I stamp it on my cardstock, I'll stamp it onto the placement guide to make sure I got it right. And then I can stamp it on my cardstock. I also use the grid lines to make sure I had my sentiment straight. Now I wanted to add some little snowflakes coming down. Now the Memory Box So Very Merry set has some little snowflakes, but I decided to pull in an older stamp set. I love to use an older stamp set with a newer stamp set. That way my older products still get some love. This is the Simon Says Stamp Don't Flurry, Be Happy. It's an older one and it is great. I'm putting my placement guide on top of my card, and this will help hold my stamps in position. Sometimes when you try to place little stamps onto a card to line them up, they want to stick to your fingers and will move around. This will kind of grab those stamps. The stamps will kind of grab onto the placement guide and hold it there while you arrange them all. Once you're happy with the arrangement, you just close the door on your stamping tool to grab those stamps and remove the placement guide. I'm stamping these with Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated ink in the Seafoam color, and you can see how it's very light. I wanted a really soft look there. I thought I'd go ahead and open up my card and stamp these snowflakes on the inside too. So, I had them placed, I might as well stamp them there. This got me thinking that I should put the Celebrate the Season sentiment on the inside of the card in the same position as the sentiment on the outside. So here's another trick with that clear placement guide. I'll put it on top of my card. Then I'll take the Celebrate the Season image and just put it right on top of the So Very Merry. I'll close the door of my stamping tool to grab that stamp, open up my card, and now stamp that in black ink on the inside. I just feel like it gives a nice flow from the inside to the outside. Because the sentiment is in the same position, it just makes it all work well. And then I did add a few more snowflakes on the inside. There's plenty of room to the left of that sentiment to write your personal message. Now it's time to add some bling. I wanted to keep this card easy to mail, so I decided to use flat confetti. These are iridescent snow flakes. Older ones that I had in my stash, but I'll link in the YouTube description to similar ones from Simon Says Stamp. I scattered those above our little friends here, and then I thought I'd use my Tonic Aqua Shimmer pen to put some shimmer on our snowman, and I didn't want the penguin to be left out, so I put some on him too. When I did this, I was very careful not to touch the coloring I did, because that might make that color bleed and move, because it does react with that water. So now he has some nice shine to him. They both do, actually. Then I used tiny little black gemstones to add eyes to both of them. I like to do this because it gives a touch of dimension and a lot of sparkle. Now I can't ignore the top of our hats, so I am using white pom-poms. What I like to do is cut a little bit off of one side of the pom-pom, not straight down the center because it would just fall apart, just a little bit off one side so it has a flat side. I then put that flat side into liquid adhesive right onto our card. It is important to put something heavy on this when it's drying so that it really grabs a hold and stays a little bit flatter than it would if you didn't put something heavy on it. So now they both have matching pom-poms on the top of their hats. Now this does add bulk. You could instead do a flat sequin if you wanted to. Now, since my card's done, I can remove that masking magic, which probably saved me from a lot of inky mess, and I can save those pieces inside of my cabinet door for the next time I need to protect a card base. I thought I'd also use that border stamp to stamp along the edge of an envelope. I'm stamping with a little bit of tone on tone, and it really pulls this card together. I think using a nice colored envelope with some stamped or stenciled images on it to match your card is a great way to really make your card special and make it stand out from something that's store-bought. All right, so now we have our completed card and envelope. This one was a fun one to put together, and because of the mirror stamping technique, I was able to get our friends to look at each other instead of one looking the other way. Also, I did kind of a fun side fold card here, but you definitely could make this a portrait card if you prefer to do that size, and it works with a variety of images. Now, I had mentioned that not everyone has a tacky mat or a mat that is made of stamp material to do mirror stamping, as I showed you before. It definitely is the best way to do it. However, I wanted to show you two other options if you don't have a mat like that. The first option is to use the back of a large clear stamp. Now, one option would be something like this. If you have a large background stamp, like this Just Because stamp from Simon Says Stamp, you can put that into your MISTI stamping tool upside down, so the flat back of the stamp is facing up towards the camera. And then you can do the exact same mirror stamping process that I showed you earlier. Now, I know not everyone has a large, clear background stamp like that. So all you need to do is look through your stash and find a big image. A big solid image is best, like this tree line from a CZ Design stamp set that I love so much. I'm putting that stamp into my MISTI stamping tool with the back of the stamp facing up towards the camera. I will then place my penguin on here to do mirror stamping. So this time I'm doing mirror stamping of the penguin, so I get a reverse image of it. So I have my penguin, and I have that solid stamp there with the flat back facing up. I'll ink up my penguin and stamp it onto the back of the tree stamp. And then I will do that a couple times just to get more ink down. You could probably do it once, but hey, why not do it a couple times? Then take a piece of white cardstock and press that right up against it, and you'll see the image transfers. You can repeat the process if you find you didn't get a good transfer of ink. Just make sure each time you put it right into the corner of your stamping tool so it lines up. And there we have a great reverse image of this penguin. So it is opposite of how that stamp was intended to be used. So because we're using stamp material, the back of the stamp, it transfers the ink beautifully. However, if you do not have a stamp to do that, you can use a piece of clear plastic such as this placement guide. This won't give as great of results, but it does work. So I have that in my MISTI stamping tool. I'm inking up my stamp and stamping it on to that clear guide. Now that clear guide won't take the ink very well, so it doesn't transfer great, but you can repeat the process a few times and build up the image, and you can get good results this way. It does take a few passes to make sure you get it just right, but if you don't have a large clear stamp or a large clear mat, this is one way you can do this technique. So now let's look at those. See how we ended up with reverse images of our stamps. So now we can use these images for more scenes where they're looking in different directions, and you can do this with a variety of different stamps. So there you have ways to do the mirror stamping technique. I really hope you give this a try, and thank you to Simon Says Stamp for having me.
I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at SimonsSaysStamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.